You're listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast.
I'm Arpita.
And I'm Deepika. You know, I'm generally excited about all our conversations, but this one's going to be big.
I think we're a little bit like that at the beginning of all our chats, but I get this one because this one is coming straight out of your childhood, and that always has the ability to bring back the child in us and get us excited.
Yeah, you know, visits to the Madras Crocodile Bank was one of the outings that my family took on holidays to Chennai, which was an annual affair for many years, and one that my sister and I both have loved. And coincidentally, we had a chance to visit it again in 2019. And, you know, even as adults, it continues to fascinate. So much so that I think it was the highlight of our trip.
Well, I'm not going to forget the many croc and monitor lizard pictures that you sent me. But, let's set it up properly. Tell us who you spoke to.
Well, I wish I could have met her at the Crocodile Bank, but considering the pandemic, I was lucky enough to meet the lovely Zai Whitaker, who's the co-founder of the Madras Crocodile Bank, on a Zoom call one morning.
So I'm Zai Whitaker, and I'm one of the founders of the Crocodile Bank, and currently it's managing trustee. And apart from being at the Croc Bank, I am also a writer and write mostly for children and mostly about the environment.
So Zai wears many hats. She started the Madras Crocodile Bank Trust in 1976 with conservationist Romulus Whitaker at a time when India's crocodile population had been exploited to the brink of extinction. She was also a teacher at the Kodaikanal International School and is a prolific writer, I think having written over 14 books for children and young adults.
You know, I remember reading one of Zai's children's books, Salim Mamu and Me. So she begins the book by sharing how her conundrum as a 6-year-old was not only that she had this amazingly renowned and well-traveled ornithologist, Salim Ali, as her uncle, but that her whole family was very skilled at knowing the birds and other creatures amidst them. And she felt left out. And, I remember being rather envious and thinking that's the kind of conundrum I'd have loved to have had as a child.
Yeah, that sounds about right. You know, as I said, what drew her to the natural world and to conservation work was actually rooted in the influence of her family. Her father, Zafar Fateh Ali, who started the World Wildlife Fund and was honorary secretary of the Bombay Natural History Society, and mother Laik Fateh Ali, a landscape designer and author.
I grew up in Bombay in Andheri, which at that point was a very different place. It was a very jungly place with jackals howling in the evenings and so on. Beautiful environment. My parents were both very passionate, very committed naturalists, great bird watchers, and we had a lot of other family and friends who were similarly very committed to natural history and conservation. So my sister, brother, and I grew up in this environment, that the weekends were all about bird watching in Karnala or Borivali National Park, and binoculars and the picnic basket were very big parts of our lives. Of course, we were always more interested in the picnic than the binoculars. So it was just the way we grew up.
It seems unreal to imagine Andheri as a jungle with wild animals. I remember going to the Bombay History Museum and coming across these pictures of old Bombay covered in forests with leopards apparently roaming about in places like Malabar Hills. It's such a dramatically different vision from the present-day Mumbai, which is full of concrete buildings and speedways. Imagine what a contraction of green space Zai must have witnessed in her lifetime.
I agree. I mean, it's a completely different visual now. But the city is where Zai did a lot of growing up and where she actually began her journey as a conservationist in many ways. It's also why she so strongly advocates for the need for open green spaces to be embedded in cities and for conservation efforts to be part of planning.
There was a very close connection with the Bombay Natural History Society, where my father was then the honorary secretary. And then actually my father was by that time very much on the international platform of conservation. And one of the things he did, which my sister and I helped him to do, was setting up WWF India. with its headquarters in Bombay.
Right.
So it was a tiny little office which the BNHS had generously loaned us. A lot of the time was spent sitting on the floor and licking envelopes and sending out our cyclostyle newsletter and so on. And my sister and I started doing programs for schools about natural history. And one of the programs we did was about common snakes, the common snakes of India, which ones were venomous, which ones were not, what to do if bitten by a snake.
I really love how naturally these experiences of childhood snowballed into the work Zai ended up doing.
Yes, and she said that whenever she or her siblings would come across snakes or other reptiles in their garden, they'd ask someone at BNHS what it was, and in the process it whetted their interest in species living around them. And I was thinking about you actually when she mentioned that, and how you've similarly taught yourself about the many butterflies and birds and dragonflies and the ilk, from all the time you spend in your garden.
Well, there is something to that process of finding joy and companionship in nature, which I think very easily slips into the space of curiosity and learning.
I think Zai would agree. I mean, joy is at the heart of it.
Growing up with these experts all around you is quite a challenge. And very often it can be quite a pain for the child who, just wants to enjoy life and not. I was probably putting more pressure on myself than was necessary. But I do remember times when I felt, not up to the mark and made a very concerted and very unnatural effort to start learning bird names. And then at some point, I think a lovely point in my life, I realized that, it's just not necessary. One can enjoy birds, one can enjoy nature without making lists of names and without knowing the Latin names of all the common birds in your garden. So I think that was an important moment in my life.
Our Latin botanical names, they are still my absolute bane. I so prefer the more fun and relatable common names any day.
I agree. Yellow-billed blue magpie or gold-billed magpie makes so much more sense than Eurocisa flaviostris. I mean, I can barely even pronounce that.
Absolutely agree. But, tell me, how did Zai turn specifically to herpetology, which is the study of amphibians and reptiles?
So it was through an exhibition being organized, which was also connected to the BNHS, where she met Zai Whitaker, a herpetologist who she married and then moved to Tamil Nadu with, where he was setting up the snake path. Also in the 1970s, crocodiles in India were on the verge of extinction because of crocodile hunting and the destruction and pollution of their habitats. So much so that surveys indicated that almost 90% of these reptiles had been completely wiped out.
So there was an urgent need to find ways to stop that and to begin some form of conservation.
Exactly, and that was the beginning.
Well, the Croc Bank is a reptile conservation organization. It's probably one of the oldest conservation organizations in the country. And it was started for the conservation of the 3 Indian species of crocodilians, which in the 70s, when it was started, were really on the brink of extinction, especially the gharial, which inhabits our northern rivers. But then over the next 4 or 5 decades, in stages, the range and depth of what we do has increased. So now it's not just the 3 crocodiles of India, but of the world. And we now have 15 of the 23 species of the world's crocodile species. And also not just crocodiles, but all reptiles. So at the moment we have 45 or so species of reptiles. Many of the more endangered ones are breeding. And the other big part of the Croc Bank, of course, is spreading public awareness, public education about why these animals are important and the need to conserve them. For instance, in the last few years, we've been focusing a lot of attention on snake bite mitigation because we realize that if you want to conserve snakes, you need to tell people how to escape death if they bite you. And of course, there's a lot of misinformation in India about snake bite treatment. People going off to healers and faith practitioners and so on. The only cure really is antivenom serum.
Oh God, yes. Snakes have so much fear attached to them that even in my neighborhood, often the first response in spotting any snake, irrespective of whether it's venomous or non-venomous, is to get rid of it. Making that shift from fear to wonder and fascination through the use of knowledge and awareness is so vital in being able to respond to the human-animal conflict, especially since we are in the midst of a period of massive biodiversity loss and extinction of species worldwide due to human intervention and tinkering.
Yeah, in fact, a new report by the Worldwide Fund for Nature and the UN Environment Programme that was released in 2021 says as much, that conflict between humans and animals is one of the main threats to the long-term survival of some of the world's most iconic species, and that India will be most affected by it. It might seem unconnected to spaces like the Crocodile Bank or to zoos, but that's exactly why conservation efforts are so crucial. That and just having spaces that children and adults alike can access in their cities to build awareness and, to start to see natural spaces and other species as contiguous to the city rather than separate. And speaking of snakes, listen to this example that Zai gave of the work they've been doing in Agumbe in the Western Ghats to research and conserve the king cobra and how they've seen a transformation in the response of the local community because of it.
One example I can give you is Agumbe in the Western Ghats, where we have a field station for the study and conservation and research of the king cobra, which, as you know, is one of the most interesting snakes in the world. And the local community in Agumbe has really gone through a sea change in their attitude to living with the king cobra. And I just saw a video the other day, a recent video that they sent us of this king cobra, this, big 12, 14-foot king cobra foraging along a field, a rice field. And just, 20 meters away is a family bringing their cows home. They know the snake is there. They're not at all worried. And nobody tries to hurt them or kill them. And king cobras are one of the most gentle snakes in the world. They, again, I've seen videos of some of these rescuers who actually sometimes need to be rescued from their own bad snake handling skills and being so rough with the snake, but the snake never made an attempt to bite this person. So I think it's in a way a metaphor for what the Croc Bank has been doing, and it's just lovely to see that. It's lovely to see the relationship between the snake and this community. I would say because of three things: education, education, and education. So when we first started, people would ring in a panic and say, there's a snake here and do something. Now they will call and say, look, there's a king cobra in my yard. Don't bother coming. If there's a problem, I'll call you. So they know that the snake will... Yeah, it's really amazing, isn't it?
Incredible, yeah.
I've heard a lot of descriptions of the king cobra, but a gentle snake has never figured in them. It seems so transformative to just see the snake from that perspective. People often forget that most reptiles are reticent and are probably more afraid of us than we are of them.
Yeah, and this journey towards education and building public awareness is very much the trajectory the Crocodile Bank has taken since its inception. Through a curriculum specially designed for children in schools, for instance, they're building this knowledge base.
That sounds great, especially because if the pandemic and the lockdown have taught us anything, it's to see how closely connected we are to the natural world and how human action affects what plays out in our environment. More and more evidence is also pointing to urban green spaces and how crucial they are to the health and well-being for all of us.
Yeah, and in the last few years, there's been so much research coming out also that speaks to exactly this. For example, a meta-analysis in 2019 by the Lancet Planetary Health found that urban green spaces can actually help people live longer, have better mental health, immune systems, and protection from diseases. And it's something Zai emphasized as well, because even as it houses over, 17 species of crocodilians, I think 3 of which are listed by the IUCN as critically endangered, the Crocodile Bank is also a veritable bird sanctuary with over 60 species spotted there, which are drawn to, the water bodies, the ponds, the large trees that make up that space. And all of this is just outside the city of Chennai.
In India, 30 to 40% of our people live in the cities. And I think the pandemic, one of the major things it's shown us is how important open spaces, green spaces in the city are, and how importantly linked to the mental health of our population. When we talk about health, we speak about things like polio eradication and so on, which we, of course, did an amazing job with. Something to be really proud of. But I think now there's more and more literature and science about the importance of open spaces for people, just to be able to relax and, have some downtime. So I think it's a very, very important topic, and I'm really hoping that now, hopefully that, we're not post-pandemic, but in the pandemic. But I hope that we start really thinking about this very seriously.
I think this is something a lot of people have come to realize through the lockdown. And it was so evident in the number of people I suddenly saw outdoors, whether it was walking or cycling, just as soon as things began to open up. And so I asked Zai about how she thought we could think about this differently.
Well, I think for me it means more than anything else that we give an equal weightage to open natural spaces that we do to constructed spaces, or hopefully even more. And that's what it really means to me. To some extent, if you're in a certain economic bracket, these things are always available and accessible to us. But that's not always the case. So it would be great if everyone had that access. And, instead of turning every other open space into money, we actually left it, in which case it's even more valuable to us than, a constructed space. Yeah, but now we're finding out that actually clean air and water are heavy cash,
It's so interesting, right, that we don't measure the value of clean air and water, but it's only when exactly those essentials for life and living become untenable that we start to wonder how we're valuing what's really important. I mean, it feels so obvious that green spaces should be part of city design.
Totally. And, it reminds me of that really often quoted native Indian saying, which goes, when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish caught, the last river poisoned, only then will we realize that one cannot eat money. And while researching this episode, I was looking through these government urban development guidelines, and they recommended 10 to 12 square meter open space per person within a city. However, most Indian cities are unsurprisingly well below this norm. And Mumbai has a mere 1.28 square meter per person. Chennai has 0.81 square meter per person. And Bengaluru offers 2 square meters, and that's the garden city. So imagine how the rest are faring.
And frankly, more than any other time, it's been through this pandemic that we've all felt the deep pull of nature to calm our frayed nerves. And, so much so that Zai mentioned how she was overwhelmed by the support they received during the pandemic.
Well, one of the few things I felt good about during the pandemic was that we got a lot of support from Chennai families, and Chennai city sees the Croc Bank as one of its own. So 4.5 lakh people visit us every year. And it's interesting that you ask about open spaces and providing that in the Croc Bank, because we've just finished this little project of making benches and picnic tables for people to spend more time here. And we see that as a very important thing, which we must contribute to: more open space, more clean air, more big trees to look at for people who come out from the city and who obviously need these resources. I've also met families, walking around the Croc Bank and talking to people. I've met many families who say, we come here for the trees. We have a lot of trees. Unfortunately, also a lot of egrets nesting here. And so sometimes we have to wear hats during the nesting season to protect ourselves from their droppings. But people do that. They come here because they love the greenery and the open spaces. And now they're also going to love sitting on these nice stone benches, many of them which will have reptile motifs on them.
That paints quite the picture. Reclining on crocodile benches, wearing a hat to avoid bird shit. But more importantly, the invitation to sit, rest, and just find pause with the trees and birds around. It sounds so great. And it's something I'm most grateful for during the lockdown, the access to green space and being able to just be with my plants.
And yet in the lockdown is also when so many clearances were given for projects that essentially take away from this right to green open spaces. It's as if in terms of governance, there's still very little recognition of what really has value and how to protect it. The Central Vista project, for instance, being a really stark example of exactly this, and it's led to, 1,800 trees being transplanted, as the newspaper reports put it, and all that for concrete structures. But this need for a shift in perception is something that Zai also pointed to.
So basically, it's just that the government has to, and, local administrative bodies have to buy into it and do it, and stop seeing this as a wasted space. It's not. It's much, much more valuable than that, 20-story building that you just made, which brings in crores of rupees. But this is bringing in much more. And it's a much more permanent benefit. So as long as we're just seeing, short-term cash as the way to go, it's not going to happen. We really need a very significant change in our mental systems. Apart from the species of wildlife, and there's always a lot more than you expect and a lot more going on. And it's just so heartening how animals can adapt to pretty crappy human-made environments. You see beautiful birds and a long species list of birds in very polluted spaces. Even the backwaters near the Croc Bank, you have pelicans and storks, and it's just amazing. So the species of trees, grasses, vegetation generally, and wildlife is just amazing. And around that, so much could be done by local parks bodies, for young people or not, for everyone.
And that's where we all come into the picture, right? Conservation isn't something that is done away from our home or living spaces in some far-off reserve or national park only. It's how we tend to our spaces and the choices we make and the decisions we make to cultivate these spaces, whether it's first learning to pay attention and being observant of what is happening around us, and then diving in to see what and where and how change can come about.
Yeah, sometimes responses to these issues can also be so overwhelming that they can feel removed from everyday decision making. But that's what I loved about Zai's suggestions and her lens on this. The idea of a city that cultivates open space for all and the many kinds of people that live in it.
My ideal city, I think, would be a green and pleasant land, as the poets put it, not just for the economically privileged, but for everyone. I think we often forget that, the less privileged also need these spaces. I think really that's a very important change we have to make. Our cities have beautiful parts to them, Lodi Gardens and Theosophical Society and so on, but accessible to a very few of us.
So Zai was saying how she considers herself lucky that even at her ripe old age, as she described it, she's still so engaged with life and with conservation. And while her family shaped much of her journey, how she has chosen this life to look at the natural world and to learn from it is something that's accessible to all of us, should we choose it.
Well, I think part of it just happens naturally because you want it to. So you become more observant, for instance. But I think at a more conscious level, there's now so much wonderful literature about the wildlife around us. When we were growing up, there was nothing. So if you wanted to know the name of a snake, for instance, you took a bus to the BNHS and found some patient fellow there who would spend time with you and talk to you. Now that's not the case.
That really is so true. Now it's so ridiculously easy to find things. Firstly, there is Google Lens, which a lot of smartphones have. And if Google Lens doesn't get it right, which can happen often, then there's lots of fantastic crowdsourced websites and guides which can help with identifying birds, plants, trees, insects.
Absolutely, so much so that I find myself looking up wildflowers and dragonflies or birds that I come by on my walks. And it's actually how I now greet the picture-wing dragonfly, spotted golden and black one. And it was all possible courtesy what the internet has to offer. And in addition to that, Zai also brought attention to what we can do in our everyday lives that adds up to bringing conservation into the everyday.
And I think the other thing is, just small changes that we can make in our own lives. We don't want to think that way because we want to be dramatic and either make some huge change or forget it. But little psychological, physical, mental changes can do a lot. So, for instance, I always find that I have to print something and read it as a printed paper to be able to fully understand it. And so now I've stopped doing that to a large extent, and I'm making myself more easy, reading on screen. So, we all have our own sort of limitations and ambits. So we should look at our own lives and make some decisions. I think it's a wonderful thing for a family to sit down and think about, as a family, what changes can we make? How can we use public transport? Can we use less paper? Can we stop buying these kitchen rolls and use old rags instead and, look after them? This rags business was a big thing when I was growing up. My mother had this bag of rags and all our old clothes. And of course, we didn't buy clothes the way one does now. You just made things last and last and last, and finally they ended up in that rags bag. And there were big rags and small rags, and, it was a big project. We used to help her cut them up and sometimes stitch the sides because all the threads would come out while you were cleaning the sink or whatever. So, I think families can do a lot. So, imagine if people stop these rolls of kitchen cleaner towels. That in itself must create a mountain of waste.
I really love the detail of what she's suggesting here. It literally is in our hands what and how we choose to use the finite resources that we have. And that's the conservation ethic, if I can call it that.
I remember something you shared with me from poet and activist Cleo Wade's work, where she says, when the world asks us big questions that require big answers, we have two options. The first, to feel so overwhelmed or unqualified we do nothing. And the second, to start with one small act and qualify ourselves. And that's what Zai's life's work represents, participating, engaging, and in the process qualifying herself. And in many ways, it's what we can choose to do in our lives each day, what we can choose to do to stay hopeful.
I need to say that for some mad reason, I'm still hopeful. I'm not a doomist. I don't believe in doomism. And I will keep that optimistic streak going, apart from anything else, because of all the wonderful people who are doing such wonderful conservation work all over the world. So I keep telling myself that it has to get us somewhere. There's so much positive energy there. There's so much commitment. And so we will get through it.
To learn more about how you can support the work of the Madras Crocodile Bank, visit their website at madrascrocodilebank.org. You can choose to adopt a reptile, donate, or plan visits for school and college-going students. Next week, in a very special extra with Zai, she'll read for us from her books and some of her favorite authors, so don't miss it. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more episodes. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or a podcast app of your convenience. We're also on YouTube, so look up the channel, The Curio-city Collective, or follow us through our social media pages. And most importantly, if you like what you're hearing, please do share these episodes with your family, friends, and community members. Leave us your thoughts, comments, and feedback. We love hearing from you.
TCC is a not-for-profit initiative that is funded by you, the listeners. If you'd like to support the work that we do at TCC, there are different ways that are listed on the support and contribute page of our website, www.thecuriositycollective.org. You can also write to us at team@thecuriositycollective.org or message us on 6300711451 if you feel called to make a contribution to sponsor an episode or a podcast series. This could help us with our research, writing, admin, and editing costs to build further resources that speak to our collective well-being. We hope you'll join us on this journey of co-creating the space to nurture and build cities that are healthy and happy.
This podcast was created by Srinidhi Raghavan, Deepika Khatri, and Arpita Joshi.